The Guerilla Girls are a feminist artist collective whose members preserve their anonymity by donning gorilla masks in public, who began in the 1980s to publicly skewer the lack of representation for female artists in the New York art world, particularly museums and galleries. And in 1988, they published their satirical Advantages of Being a Woman Artist, which included, along with working without the pressure of success and not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits or not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius, knowing your career, let me turn this on, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80. And last year, the Frye Art Museum hosted a luminous exhibition of the work of Catherine Bradford. It was her first solo museum show, and it was organized initially by the Portland, Maine Art Museum in 2022, i.e., the year she turned 80. And that made me think again about the Guerilla Girls and that quip of theirs, knowing your career might pick up when you turn 80, which happened more than 35 years later for Catherine Bradford. And when we think of late life artists, particularly women, the most obvious example is Grandma Moses. But it's not Grandma Moses that the Guerilla Girls were thinking about, because Moses began to paint only very late in life after her fingers became too arthritic for needlework. And she was always considered an outsider artist. The Guerilla Girls were thinking about those artists who had been banging their heads against the doors of the art world for decades, who had been plugging away at their artistic careers with no acclaim, no recognition, who finally, very late in life, achieved some measure of success. So they might have been thinking of someone like Alice Neel, who appeared on The Tonight Show just a couple of years before that Guerilla Girls poster. Alice Neel, who for Johnny Carson's audience was a cute little old lady, talking about a book recently published on her art, but who the year she turned 80 produced this pitiless, but not humorless, self-portrait, naked at her easel, seated in a striped blue armchair and letting it all hang out. Alice Neel shows us a body that has birthed 4 children, a body that has known decades of gravity, but also of pleasure, and the kind of body that we do not see in Western media. And she stares at us, and really at herself, with those piercing blue eyes. Now, by this time, Neel had been using nudity to puncture the comfort of her sitters for over half a century. This is her 1930 portrait of Ethel Ashton, which Neel herself describes as, quote, great for women's lib because she's almost apologizing for living, end quote. So we see her voluminous body, but her anxious, small, triangular face there at the top in shadow. Neel is using nudity here to get us, the viewers, out of our comfort zone. Now, Neil came out of the social realism of the 1920s and 30s, but she never gave that up. So she continued it into the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, when abstract expressionism and minimalism and pop art held sway in the art world, an art world that didn't rediscover Neil until the new interest in figuration that occurred in the late 1970s, early 1980s. But here we see that Neil is still, in 1980, using nudity, here the nudity of her granddaughter, Victoria, perilously carrying a cat. And this composition captures a moment. We get the sense that this is just about to spiral out of control, that cat is not going to stay there for long, that Victoria herself already has 1 foot out of the picture plane. Her face is unusually asymmetrical, even for Alice Neil, and the nudity here gives a sense of vulnerability. We imagine cat scratch, and also a sense of innocence in this prepubescent figure. It's very different from the nudity in the self-portrait or in the Ethel Ashton, or again, a couple of years later, in Neil's portrait of Annie Sprinkle. Porn star and performance artist and sex positivity guru who posed in her vintage fetish wear, including those 1950s stiletto heels. Sprinkle reported that Neil was particularly interested in her new labial piercing and making sure to get that exactly right. In the painting, Sprinkle also felt that Neil conveyed her breasts magnificently. But here, the nudity is a different strategy. Here it is one of power, but again of pleasure that we see in the self-portrait as well. So throughout her career, Neil painted people who interested her. She didn't paint portraits for the most part for money, not people who came to her saying, paint my portrait, but rather she approached people and said, I would like to paint you. And very often those were people on the left politically, people involved with the socialist movement in the 1930s, with the labor movement. And here at the age of 81, she is painting Gus Hall, the general secretary of the Communist Party USA. Remarking on this man, quote, he was 70 years old. He spent 10 of those 70 years in jail. End quote. So for Neil, Hall was a political prisoner, and yet still powerful and committed at the age of 70, looking at us with those piercing blue eyes. In 1984, the last year of her life, the year that she appeared on The Carson Show, Neil was facing a terminal cancer diagnosis and also cataracts that she said, quote, are so bad that for me to work now is just heroic, end quote. And she paints another granddaughter, Elizabeth, in a red hat, red with white polka dots, whereas Elizabeth's socks are white with red polka dots. And Elizabeth is a bit older than her cousin Victoria, a bit more self-possessed, her eyes shaded by the jaunty brim of that hat, on the verge of womanhood, a womanhood that Neil knew that she herself would not be around to see. So she had to capture this moment. Because it was all she was going to have of the woman Elizabeth Neil would become. Now, a few years earlier, another very elderly artist, had appeared on The Tonight Show. This was Imogen Cunningham in her 93rd year. And I should note that both she and Neil appeared on The Tonight Show in the very last year of their lives. So if there are any artists out there, if you are asked to be on The Tonight Show, put it off as long as you can. Now, the most persistent, the most memorable image that we have of Imogen Cunningham is this one. This photograph by her protege, Judy Dator, of Imogen and model Twinka Tebow at Yosemite. And Cunningham appears as this almost elf-like creature, tiny and ancient, and she had, throughout her career, frequently photographed both nudes and trees, landscape, Yosemite. She was, in fact, awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1970 at the age of 86, but it was not to create new work, but to print work from her earlier negatives. Now, her colleagues, her friends, Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, they had received Guggenheim Fellowships decades earlier, but she was overlooked until it was considered that she was so elderly, she was no longer going to make new work. However, they might have been surprised because even in her 80s, Cunningham was making rather cutting-edged images. This one, called Painting and William Halliman, from 1964, when she was 81, was made for an advertising campaign for a new kind of Polaroid camera. And it was rejected by the much younger artistic director, a male photographer, because it wasn't what he was expecting from an 80-plus-year-old female photographer. It is too sensual. It is too strange. And yet, it is the kind of work that Cunningham insisted on doing. She kept herself young by surrounding herself with young people, like Halliman or Phoenix. So the hippies that came to San Francisco, where she lived for the summer of love and stayed, some of them gravitated to Cunningham's studio, where she would make images of them like Phoenix recumbent. So in a way, this is almost a pictorialist nude from the very beginning of her career, at the beginning of the 20th century. But in other ways, it's very contemporary, and the name, probably the adopted name of this lovely young woman, Phoenix, also suggests what we see in her swirls of hair. We can imagine a kind of Asian phoenix rising from the flames. Cunningham was a pacifist. You might have noticed that she was wearing a peace symbol necklace when she appeared on The Tonight Show, and she was drawn to make photographs of other people who shared her pacifist philosophy, like this one of Morris Graves in his leek garden, looking monk-like there among the alliums. And this was made when she was 90. But a couple of years later, at the age of 92, she began a new project. She called it Over 90. It was to be a book of photographs of people living well after the age of 90. And she included this photograph of Irene Bobby LeBerry, even though being only 83, LeBerry didn't really qualify. However, this is an image of a woman whose husband was a tattoo artist. And so she had tattoos, her husband's art, covering her body. And she had never disrobed for a total stranger before. But Cunningham, the Cunningham of that Twinka photograph, that tiny white-haired old lady, established the kind of trust that encouraged this sitter to feel comfortable displaying that body for a photograph. And this is an image that I think could only have been made by an extremely elderly female artist. Now, Louise Bourgeois did not have to wait until she was 80 to have her break in the art world. It came about the year she turned 70. When, in 1982, she was given a one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the most prestigious venue possible. So she had been working in obscurity for many years before this, and the MoMA directors asked Robert Mapplethorpe to photograph Bourgeois, who impishly poses with one of her earlier sculptures, a latex work called fillette, which means little girl in French, but which is obviously neither little nor female. So the 1982 exhibition catapulted her and her whole career into the eye of the art world. However, 10 years earlier, when Mary Beth Adelson wanted to include Louise Bourgeois as one of the apostles flanking Georgia Jesus O'Keeffe in her collage, Some Living American Woman Artists, Adelson searched through catalogs and art history books and all of the visual information she could find, and the most recent photograph that she could come up with of Louise Bourgeois is this one, which was taken in 1945. So although some women artists were aware of her career, considered her as an elder, she was really working in obscurity right up until that 82 retrospective. Now, in 1991, the year when Bourgeois turned 80, she completed her first cell. It would be the first of a series of installations that she called cells. And of course, a cell is, on the one hand, a building block of life, and on the other hand, a place of confinement, a monastic room, a prison cell. And Bourgeois herself said, quote, "The cells represent different types of pain, the physical, the emotional and psychological, and the mental and intellectual. When does the emotional become physical? When does the physical become emotional? It's a circle going round and round," end quote. And these cells also, in addition to pain, deal with memory. So in this first cell, with its circle of doors surrounding it, in the center is a circular mirror with Bourgeois' earlier marble sculpture of clasped hands upon it, and then an arrangement of bottles of her mother's favorite perfume. So she was deeply interested in surrealism. She had been in Freudian analysis for many years, and she's dredging up the pain and the sweetness of her own childhood. The Celle Choisie is a reference to her childhood home in Choisy, clearly with a guillotine hanging over it. This is not a cell that is intended to be entered, but some of Bourgeois' cells, like this Passage Dangereux from 1997, have doorways and have large enough spaces to provide passage for a human. And you can see inside the cyclone fencing that creates the boundaries of the cell, you can see chairs hanging up and fragments of tapestries, because her family growing up had a business of repairing and restoring tapestries. And in fact, from an early age, Bourgeois was designing the pieces, the areas of tapestries that had moldered away, that had been destroyed, which was very often the feet, the lower edges. And then the chairs would be hanging in her childhood home, ready to be reupholstered with fresh or freshly repaired tapestry bits. So these references are to her childhood home, which also felt like a prison to her. Arch of Hysteria refers to that interest in Freudianism. And Bourgeois was interested in the early history of psychiatry that included cases of women who would contort their bodies. They would arch their backs, or they would contract in on themselves, or they would spin around in unending circles with, from what the doctors could tell, no physical illness causing these symptoms, these very bodily symptoms. So in 1993, she makes her Arch of Hysteria of just such an arching figure, but she uses a male body. She uses her studio assistant, casts the figure in bronze, and then polishes it to such a high sheen that we can all see ourselves in this Arch of Hysteria. The eye is a key surrealist motif. And throughout her career, Bourgeois would circle back to earlier themes. So this 1996 dry point, an etching technique of eyes, is a reworking of a drawing from 1974 that we see inset below. But then she takes these two-dimensional images and realizes them in 3 dimensions, like the eye benches in black Zimbabwe granite that grace the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle that were made in her mid-80s, or this even later amalgamation of pink marble eyes now in Tate Modern. That have something of the uncanny about them. Now I have to do a content warning because I'm about to show you a lot of spiders. It is Bourgeois' most famous motif. And for Bourgeois, the spider and all of her spiders were made when she, beginning when she was in her 80s. The spider was a symbol of her mother. She would say, quote, "Like a spider, my mother was a weaver. My family was in the business of tapestry restoration, and my mother was in charge of the workshop. Like spiders, my mother was very clever. Spiders are friendly presences that eat mosquitoes. We know that mosquitoes spread diseases and are therefore unwanted. So spiders are helpful and protective, just like my mother. And here in the nest, she depicts a mother spider who is protecting her young, who range in size from very small to larger, to larger, to larger. So although for Bourgeois, spiders are protective and beneficial creatures, she surely knew very well that for many people, spiders are nightmare creatures. Spiders are scary. Spiders make our skin crawl. Now, she would do many iterations of spiders, and she would do many different variations on her cells, but she only made one work in which she combined the two, her spider cell from 1997. When she was 85 or 86. So this one we are intended to enter so that someone can sit in this cell and be completely protected by the spider, but also completely entrapped by the spider. And there are, again, fragments of tapestry arrayed on the walls and in the interior, and several of them are just feet, just limbs. So this is, again, something about her earliest memories that she's continuing to dredge up and to exorcise in her 80s. And perhaps her most magnificent works are the enormous spiders, like this Maman in Zurich, that just dominate the public spaces in which they are sited. You can see how tiny our friend human scale looks there. In her 90s, as it became more difficult to work on such heroic proportions and in 3 dimensions, Bourgeois continued to make images along similar lines, but in 2 dimensions. Here, again, with the dry point technique, creating this spider woman with a human face attached to all of those spiky limbs. And one of her very last works is this one, I Do, from 2010, which looks a bit like a pair of red poppies on a single stem, but also like ovaries, again, with her interest in the human body. And this work was made as a fundraiser for the, I didn't write it down, but no, I did, the Freedom to Marry initiative. So here we have a 98-year-old artist making this somewhat edgy image in support, and a heterosexual artist who had, she was born in France, married an American, adopted a French baby just before they moved to the United States, and then had 2 biological children with her husband, Robert Goldwater. So this heterosexual, very elderly woman making art in support of the LGBTQ+ community and their right to marry. Alma Thomas is an artist who had to battle both sexism and racism in her career. And she had gotten her, she really did not begin her career as an artist. She didn't really have the time to focus intensively on her own art making until she retired from teaching at the age of 69. So she had first gotten an art education degree and a job teaching kindergarten. And she decided that that was not for her, so she went back to Howard University in DC, and in 1924 was the very first graduate of the art department of Howard. And she got a job then teaching art in the segregated public schools in a junior high school in DC. But throughout her teaching career, she was constantly learning, visiting museums in New York and DC and in Europe, and taking classes whenever she could from the best professors at the universities, white and black, in the DC area. So this is the work that she considered, on the left, the work that she considered her breakthrough work. It's called Watusi, Hard Edge, and it was made in the year that she turned 72. And it is a reworking of Henri Matisse's cutout, The Snail. So to get Watusi, you basically take the snail and you turn it 90 degrees to the left. You change the color palette. You paint it in acrylic rather than cut and pasted paper. And you give it the title of a Chubby Checker song. So she's appropriating, she's so aware of her predecessors in the modern art world. She was also became the vice president of a gallery, the first gallery in the DC area to specialize in the art of African Americans. So she knew the DC art world very well. But by the time she turned 80, she had developed her signature technique of splotches of color, different sized patches of color against a luminous white ground. These have been likened to Byzantine mosaics and to pointillism of the late 19th century. They are also part of the color field movement in painting, which had important proponents, Morris Louis and Kenneth Noland and Sam Gilliam, working in the DC area. But her most important influence is nature itself. She calls this her earth sermon, beauty, love, and peace. And she would take long drives out to the seashore or to the countryside to paint. But one of her favorite destinations was the greenhouses where flowers were grown. And you can imagine this as being something somewhat like what the Skagit Valley looks like right now, with rows of crocuses, daffodils, hyacinths, and the like. Now, in her early 80s, she developed a new theme in her art. She became fascinated by space, by the space race, by astronauts. So in 1972, she paints this Starry Night and the astronauts. It is a clear reference to Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, and in the pixelation of those patterns, in the way that she has alternated very dark indigos with ultramarines and azures, we get something of the swirling feeling of Starry Night, and apparently that patch of rainbow colors is there to represent the astronaut, some sort of a spaceship. In 1972, she also painted Mars dust, imagining the red planet in patches of red, not against her usual white ground, but here against a variegated blue ground, again giving us that sense of starry night, of space, of infinity. And in 1974, she painted this astronaut's view of Earth, inspired by the iconic photograph, that generation-shaking photograph of the big blue marble, of our little planet in the immensity of space. Here she uses a solid blue ground and then a circle in which densely spaced rows of blue, of ultramarine blue, float above oranges and reds, whites and yellows. And Thomas was painting in the era when minimalist artists like Ellsworth Kelly and Frank Stella were using protractors and making very hard-edged geometric paintings. Thomas, though, her work is resolutely handmade. She's not drawing that circle of Earth with a compass, but with her own free hand. In 1973, she paints this wind and crepe myrtle concerto. This very soft image. If you're not familiar with crepe myrtle, it's a sort of bush or tree that explodes into fluffy pink flowers in late summer. And so we get this sense of blossoming. There's a green ground here behind the pale pink and brighter pink petals. And she calls this a concerto because she's very interested in music, in evoking music in her art. White Roses Sing and Sing replaces her usual rows of patches with more circular arrangements, or even rose or cotton blossom-like arrangements of patches that then spread out to fill the remaining space. Now, by this time, she was having health challenges and having quite a bit of arthritic pain. So she would do some paintings like This Fall Begins in a softer technique, a more impressionist sort of abstraction perhaps, but it didn't require quite the precision of those patches that are well bounded. So even though she's now 85, she's changing her art. She's adapting it to her physical limitations. But one of my favorite works of hers ignores her physical limitations, continues to work in that original style of the patches, but varying it in a new way here and working really large. So this is a triptych. It's over 6 feet high, over 12 feet wide. Red azaleas singing and dancing rock and roll music. And we see these red forms, like the patches of a giraffe, these organic forms, some of them curving, some of them, her more rectilinear forms, and they're quite concentrated in the upper left corner, and then they become farther and farther apart. There is more white, there is more ground, as if the wind is blowing them around the edges, and we can just imagine them infused with a rock and roll, infused with a sort of joy. And Thomas was criticized by some of her younger colleagues for not directly addressing the civil rights movement, for not making socially committed art that talked about the difficulties of the situation of being Black in America. But she felt that being an elderly Black woman painting large-scale abstractions, that was revolution enough. For her, that was an act of resistance. Agnes Martin also had to adapt her style later in her life. So Martin had developed her signature style in her late 40s. By 1960, she had settled on a 6-foot grid of subtly modulated colors that she hoped the viewer would come very close to and be enveloped in this human-scaled canvas. So here her white flower has these very gentle, hand-painted but grid-like patterns of grays and whites. Now, Martin achieved a great deal of success with these paintings in the early 1960s. But she retreated from the New York art world in 1967. And she ended up living in New Mexico, far from the center of the art world, but she spent time in mental institutions. She had a form of schizophrenia that made the pressures of the art world particularly difficult for her. So she sort of escaped into obscurity for a number of decades before herself being rediscovered late in life. Martin was deeply inspired by Zen Buddhism, and she considered her painting to be a meditative act, and it was one that calmed her demons, that improved her mental status. And when she hit her 90s? Wait, let me do the math. Hang on, 1912. When she hit her 80s, when she was in the decade in which she had turned 80, she made 2 changes to her, by this time, nearly 40-year practice. So she switched from oil paint to the less toxic medium of acrylic paint. And she switched from 6-foot squares to 5-foot squares. Those were easier for her to handle when she was in her 80s. So this is her Happy Holiday from 1999 with these bands of very pale pinks enveloping the viewer, and she hoped bringing the kind of consolation that she found in the act of painting these works. But this is why it is so surprising to see in her very latest works, as she entered her 90s, these new motifs popping up. So this is still acrylic, it is still a 5-foot square, but now we have triangles, these very stark motifs that look a bit like teepees, perhaps, or they could be yellow snow-capped mountaintops reminiscent of the peaks near her home in New Mexico. But they also bear a sneaky resemblance to perky breasts with yellow nipples. And so it is this delightful surprise of these works from her last couple of years where she lets go of the sameness, really, of much of her work and incorporates some new shapes. Yayoi Kusama is another artist who has suffered from serious mental illness, and another artist who, like Martin, achieved fame and a certain level of success in the New York art world in the early 1960s. So she's pictured here in her signature polka dots and orange wig. This image is her Face of Youth from 2015. And this is from a series of paintings, the My Eternal Soul series, that she began when she turned 80 in 2009. So she has now made hundreds of these My Eternal Soul series. Very often they feature faces. Very often they feature dots. These are motifs that help her battle, help her feel integral against the voices that give her a fear of dissolution. She had this fear of falling apart. And so she had come to New York City in the early 1960s and had made performance art and conceptual art. And in New York City, she made her first infinity room. This one employs those polka dots. And she had a lifelong fear of male sexuality that comes out of some traumatic early childhood incidents. So here she makes a room with mirrors on all sides, and she fills it with these comical, soft, red polka-dotted tuber-like shapes, or phallic shapes, that make them unthreatening, make them something you can comfortably flop upon, make them comical. And she photographs herself in the middle of this infinity of these red and white polka dot shapes. However, she was having more and more difficulties with schizophrenia as well. And she ended up returning to Japan, having some years of just nearly total despair. And then in 1977, she checked herself in to an asylum. And she lives in that asylum to this day. So it is just a couple of blocks from her studio. So every day she walks to her studio and she paints all day, but at the end of the day, she returns to the safety of that mental institution. She began making infinity rooms again when she turned 80. And this is her infinity mirrored room, aftermath of obliteration of eternity. So to make these rooms, she creates spaces that are mirrored on all sides and have water on the floor. So there are reflective surfaces in all directions. They're in total darkness except for the LED lights that she places there that create the visual effect of eternity, of these beautiful lights going on in every direction. And so this was the work that she made to celebrate her own 80th birthday. And it references the annual Buddhist water lantern ceremony that honors one's ancestors. So the visitor is invited to step into the room and have the door close and have this mirage appear before you. It's really very beautiful and very moving, but then in about a minute, the light entirely disappears. And then the cycle begins again. So it's about death and rebirth. And all the eternal love I have for the pumpkins features the polka-dotted kabocha squash, which is a food stuff that she has great affection for. It's almost a stand-in for herself, these pumpkins, this one in a similar infinity room. Well, in 2017, a 50-year retrospective of her work opened at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. So Kusama was then 88. And there were 6 infinity mirror rooms in that exhibition. And it traveled to 5 museums in the US and Canada. And these rooms became a sensation for a selfie-loving public. So you can see that there is a person here in the center, holding up their camera, making an image of themselves. And in fact, after the exhibition closed at the Hirshhorn, the Smithsonian reported that it had garnered 330 million mentions of the hashtag Infinite Kusama. So she becomes this internet star at the age of 88. Her Chandelier of Grief is, I think, one of her most beautiful infinity rooms, this one in the Tate Modern in London. It is in a hexagonal structure. It's nearly, it's about 12 feet high. And you go in by a sliding door, and then this room is illuminated by a single chandelier. And yet you get this sort of destabilizing idea of light everywhere, of an infinity of chandeliers. It's this optical illusion that is extraordinary. They're above you, they're below you, they are all around you, and it's absolutely mesmerizing. She calls it Chandelier of Grief because she's interested in complex psychological states like grief, but she also means for it to offer consolation, which is exactly what she is hoping for her message of love directly from my heart unto the universe, a work that she made during the pandemic for the brand new Grand Central Madison in New York City. So here she is using her polka dots and her suns with happy faces and other motifs that have recurred throughout her career, but it's created with brilliant glass mosaic titles, and she included a message with this work saying, quote, "I offer you a message of love directly from my heart unto the universe. May you all experience the true beauty of loving humanity. Human life is beautiful. My wish is to deliver this vision with all that is in my life to the people of New York," end quote. In the middle of COVID, this is her response at the age of 93. But the most extreme example of late life discovery of a lifelong artist that I came across is the case of Carmen Herrera, who died in 2022 at the age of 106. Now, Herrera was born in Havana, in Cuba, in 1915, and although she sold a painting at the age of 19, she did not have another sale for 70 years until she was 89. She originally intended to study architecture, as in fact did Alma Thomas. But I think both of these women, particularly Alma Thomas, realized that as a woman and as a Black woman, there was no place for her in the world of architecture. Herrera may have come to a similar conclusion or simply preferred abstraction, preferred creating these elegant, streamlined images on which she worked her entire career. So Herrera married an American school teacher. And for a while, she was quite important in the Cuban art scene, but they moved to New York City in the 1940s. And then in the 1950s, they lived for a few years in Paris, where she knew people like Ellsworth Kelly, who were developing hard-edged minimalism. And it was in Paris that she really finalized her artistic vision of a very sophisticated, hard-edged minimalism, ideally with only 2 colors per image, and those colors were often black and white. So in 2009, she made this screen print, black and white, but it's a print that is a restating of an earlier work that she had made in the 1960s so that it could have a wider audience than that one single work. As a multiple. She once said that she had never met a straight line she didn't like. And then in 2017, she began to collaborate with the philanthropic enterprise Publicolor, which brings art into the New York schools. Brings art to the most disadvantaged school campuses and involves the students themselves in the creating of this art. So this is a wall mural that is a 1952 work. So it's a work that she had originally painted 65 years earlier. That now the 102-year-old artist is collaborating with middle school students to tape the walls and to measure it out and to replicate this work so that it becomes part of their academic experience. She also had the opportunity after the age of 100 to realize sculptural projects that she had initially designed some 50 years earlier. So this is her pavan, which she originally made the model for back in 1967 when her brother had died very young. So it's a memorial for her brother, but she never had the opportunity to make it happen in steel, in aluminum, on a monumental scale until 2019, until much, much later. So she made, as an elderly artist, these statuettes, these models that she was then able to work with a foundry, with a fabricator, and realize these creations on a monumental scale as public art. She had also imagined works of metal art back in the 60s that she was not able to realize until, in this case, 2016, the year she turned 101. So this is her untitled Estrutura Yellow. And it is 2 sheets of yellow painted aluminum. Here the other color is the white of the wall. But you'll notice that they are not flush to the wall. One of them is, the one on the left is angled out at the top. The one on the right is angled out at the bottom so that they project about 5 inches at top left and bottom right. And also the one on the right is not flush with the one on the left. It is just slightly lower, which creates this sense of tension. And once she was discovered at about, in her 90s, nearing the age of 100, critics went wild for the precision and elegance of her minimalism. The National Gallery also purchased her Untitled from 2013, which is an hourglass shape, a shape that a nearly 100-year-old artist might well be focusing on, but it is also the kind of pattern of a harlequin's garb, and harlequins are favorite subjects of Picasso and other early 20th century modernists. At the age of 101, she painted this night forest in blue and green hues. And then 5 years later, at 106, she got to see Movado produce a limited edition of watches with the same design. Unfortunately, they only made 100, and they sold out very quickly. So this artist had the extraordinary experience of turning 100 and seeing herself in the New York Times. At the age of 101 in 2016, she was given a career retrospective by the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. It's the rare artist who gets their first one-person show at the age of 101. Now, that narrative is irresistible, isn't it? There is just something captivating about the idea of the woman artist who has labored in obscurity for decades and is finally recognized in her twilight years. But most artists don't have the luxury of living to 100 years old. We know that part of the reason these artists struggled to find an audience was sexism, and in some cases, racism as well. And this is another Publicolor collaboration that reproduces Herrera's 1987 work Diagonal in triplicate, uno, dos, tres, for a junior high school in East Harlem, in Spanish Harlem. And Herrera said at the time that she was, quote, particularly proud that students, so many of them Spanish-speaking like me, will be creating this, end quote. And we see this almost miraculous collaboration between an extremely elderly artist and a group of teenagers, a collaboration that has the potential to radically alter these young people's view of what it is to grow old. But we might still wish that this recognition were not so belated. So I'm going to leave Herrera the last words. When she was asked about finally getting that show at the Whitney at 101, she responded, quote, "It's about time. Better late than never. A little earlier would have been nice," end quote. Thank you. So I imagine some of these artists may be brand new to you, but I hope you've enjoyed being exposed to them. Are there any questions? Images you'd like a second look at? Yes. An observation. The COVID masks go with the art. So this was painted in October 2020. It was something that could be done. It's on a playground. So this is an outdoor work of art. So that could be done in October 2020, whereas something like that interior one, they probably wouldn't have done in 2020. That one was from 2019. So yes, these students have COVID masks, as you so correctly observe, and it's, and you can see that it's a multiracial group of students and volunteers, very proud of their work, creating this, continuing to make art during the pandemic, just as Yayoi Kusama's work for that new Grand Central Station was done during the pandemic as well. Other questions or comments? Over here. Yes, please.
I saw that the Louise Bourgeois Foundation was listed on Lopez Island. Do you know anything about that?
It's not the question is about the Louise Bourgeois Foundation being on Lopez Island. It's not the Louise Bourgeois Foundation that's on Lopez Island. It is the Imogen Cunningham Foundation that is on Lopez Island. Her granddaughter is the head. Let me see if we can get back to, there we go. There's one. So her granddaughter is the head of the Imogen Cunningham Trust. It is based on Lopez Island. They do not have a public venue, at least not yet. I don't know. I suspect that you could write to the foundation. They do have a website. They have a web presence. And you might be able to write to the foundation for permission to go and look at works in person. They hold the rights to reproducing Cunningham's work. So they have the negatives, and it is only through the Cunningham Trust that you can commission new legal prints of Cunningham's work. Was there something else I was going to say about that? Now I can't remember what it was. But at any rate, that yes, it is based on Lopez Island, but there is not a museum there that you can visit in person. Did the Guerilla Girls get the job done? That is a really interesting question. They certainly have had an impact. And after a few years, it was pointed out to them, this happened multiple times in the history of American feminism, it was pointed out to them that their concerns were fairly white. And so they began to advocate as well for greater racial inclusion in the New York art world. I think they've had a tremendous impact, actually. What is this spring's or winter's exhibit at Seattle Art Museum? Jean Quick-to-See Smith, again, an 84-year-old Native American woman, getting her first major museum retrospective. Actually, I should have put her in. But you couldn't have imagined that back in the 80s. She was struggling to get art by Native women seen in tiny local university museums back in the 80s. So museums are doing a better job. There are more women in art school now than men, but male artists still fetch the highest prices. When the Guerilla Girls started, they made lists, sort of lists of shame of the the big New York galleries and how many women they represented among their artists, and it was about 4% female. 4%. So some women, and even some galleries run by women, did not have a single female artist in their stable. Some had one token woman, or maybe two. And now I believe the percentage is closer to 30. So that's from 4% to 30 is a big leap. It's still not parity. And men still fetch artwork by men still fetches considerably higher prices than artwork by women. But it's moving in the right direction. So yes, the Guerilla Girls had a major impact. And things like that, well, that billboard, this was put up as a billboard in Manhattan. It wasn't a small little work that was just seen by people who were museum goers. It was seen by people driving down the freeway in New York City. And yeah, it has had an impact. Yes?
I'm curious, the woman with the spider statues, how often was she the one doing the physical building of them versus her not being able to do so?
So Louise Bourgeois, how often was she doing the physical work of building something like this? Here, I'd say she's doing the physical work. But when it moves to something like this, in this case, she is most likely, or particularly the very large-scale bronzes, this would be cast in a foundry by experts at casting very large-scale bronze. This is something that really no artist has the expertise to do. Any artist working in bronze is going to work with a foundry, work with people who make it their career to cast bronze in a way that is not going to come crashing down on the people underneath it and cause an international incident. So in cases like this, she's designing these, but she is not executing them. But she's supervising. She's part of the process. But that is how most artists work with bronze. Yes.
Speaking of art in schools,
Mm-hmm.
just last week in the Seattle Times, I read about some donors who were giving their art collection, this is in Seattle, to schools rather than to SPAM to be, put stored, rather than exhibited. I just thought, and some of the slides you showed reminded me of that.
So that's a really interesting comment that apparently some local donors are giving their works to schools rather than giving them to SAM to sit in storage so that the works will be seen, so that the works will be interacted with, like the Carmen Herrera murals in the junior high schools in New York City, which I think is really promising. I like that idea a lot. And I wish that SAM would be loaning their works out instead of letting it sit in storage. Yes?
One that was the globe that she did that was hers from,
Oh, Alma Thomas, yes.
so her things were always flat until that globe. And then almost you could see the Escher ledges in there. So all of a sudden you see on top of like buildings and stuff. So I thought it was amazing that she accomplished both.
So I'm sorry, could you say that again? I didn't quite.
When you look at that, I see the white parts of her flat being tops of high-rise buildings. So it becomes like an Escher painting.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, so the comment is that she's creating here a sense of three-dimensional space that is almost Escher-like in those, the whites looking like they're projecting, looking like they are tops of buildings and valleys in between. That's really interesting. I have never seen that work this way. That is a really interesting comment. So yeah, I think her work is just beautiful. But I also think it's really interesting that this artist hits her 80s and all of a sudden it's like, wow, space is really cool. I'm going to incorporate that into my paintings. And she makes these really amazing paintings. I mean, this one's owned by the National Air and Space Museum in the Smithsonian Air and Space in DC. And it is probably seen by more people than it would be in a modern art museum. So this, I don't know, this has a sense of space as well, whereas this one seems a little more like surface patterning. But yeah, it's an interesting tension in her work. Oh, yes, of course, that's worth reading, the advantages of being a woman artist. Working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labeled feminine, not being stuck in a tenured teaching position, seeing your ideas live on in the work of others, having the opportunity to choose between career and motherhood, not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits, having more time to work after your mate dumps you for someone younger, being included in revised versions of art history, not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius, and finally getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. So they call themselves the conscience of the art world. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Enjoy the sunshine.